Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for a time in this country that is we're so blessed. But we remember people within our own community, within our church, who are going through difficult times. And we just ask that you bless those that we mentioned here, and that you bless the people in Ukraine who cannot imagine what they're going through. We just ask for comfort to them. And dedication in the way as we show the flags and signs for this country. I just pray that somehow this tragedy will come to an end. We thank you for blessings in our community. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. I want to do something different this morning. I asked Carolyn if she would do a poem, and she said she was out of her class, and she said, call Tammy, and I didn't have nerve to call her at 9 o'clock on Saturday night to do a poem. So we're going to be submitted something worse than that. I wrote, some years ago, I wrote essays about what life was like when I was a kid, what life was like as an adult. It's just sort of a running account for our family. Some of them relate to church, community, and so forth. This one's called Devils in Church, ? Why is it that mean red wasps like to live in a church building? The old wood frame building of Mount Carmel Baptist Church near Chapel Hill, founded in 1803, housed some of the meanest wasps I ever encountered. As a child, I attended that church until the building was dismantled in '65 for a new, larger brick building. Mount Carmel outside Chapel Hill was heated during my childhood by wood heaters. There were two in the auditorium, one on the right side, one on the left, with flues that came together in a T that connected to a chimney. The auditorium was not very large, but seat location verified your age or your sex. The older men sat in the section on the right, while the elder women occupied the section on the left. Younger families with small children sat in the middle section. Teenage girls and boys often sat in the back pews in this section. Two classrooms on the left and the right had sliding windows. They were actually wooden windows that could be used down for Sunday school and up for the worship service. Often young adults preferred these rooms, and teenage boys usually took over the back benches. My brother-in-law tells of sitting in the back row of one of these rooms. A bald man began to nod during the preaching service, whereupon a wasp lighted on his shiny crown. One of the boys could not resist, so he slyly took his hand pan and teased the investigator, whereupon the wasp sunk his stinger, bringing a startled whoop from the victim. Needless to say, the boy seated beside him received no more spiritual inspiration from that sermon. Small rooms in the back of the church were used for Sunday school classes. When I was 9, the junior boys class was located in the organ room on the second floor, so named because of an old pump organ that was stored there, one that was no longer in use. It was a crowded, small room by today's standards and had one window. Mrs. Lizzie Rich, a kind lady who I fondly remember, wore hats and long dresses and was our Sunday school teacher. I don't remember any one scripture lesson that she taught, but her love and caring came through to 9-year-old boys, and we appreciated it. Before class began, though, we had to have a wasp killing. This consisted of opening the window, propping it open with a stick or a small chair, taking our Sunday school quarterly, and killing most of the wasps that didn't fly out the window. We accepted the routine, the same as prayer, and memory verse quotation, and Bible studies. The old church building is now only a picture on a commemorative plate, but I can still see it clearly in my mind, and those mean red wasps.
Thank you, Tom. I thought that was going to be an allegory of how sometimes we have mean people in church. But I'm glad it didn't turn out that way. The wasps.
Sting or a sword.
Yes, I know. That's great. So we're shifting gears a little bit today. We've been in the Gospel of Matthew for the past several weeks. But today we're moving into the Gospel of John, which is obviously one of the canonical Gospels, meaning it is included in the New Testament text, but it is not one of what scholars call the Synoptic Gospels. And the Synoptic Gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And they're considered synoptic and considered as a group because scholars believe that they share common sources, with Mark being kind of the primary source of the other two, along with other sources that Matthew and the authors of Matthew and Luke use to construct their stories. But John's different. John's a different sort of gospel. And giving a little bit of a thematic background to it, I think it's important to kind of remember as we go through that in John, Jesus doesn't speak in parables. Jesus doesn't heal lepers or perform exorcisms, and doesn't give his instructions to his disciples on how to pray the Lord's Prayer or celebrate the Lord's Supper. And there's no mention of a birth narrative. So, in the synoptics, there's that story of Jesus' birth and all that surrounds that. There's no transfiguration, and there aren't accounts of him eating with outcasts or calling people to renounce their earthly possessions. So we're getting a different perspective on Jesus in this particular gospel. The style in John is different too. Instead of employing, like I said, the parables that are often used in the other gospels, John has Jesus speak in long philosophical discourses. And instead of speaking about the kingdom of God or Jewish law and other various matters of kind of morality, Jesus talks primarily about himself and makes claims to his relationship to God. And he speaks about his identity as the one who came to reveal the Father and what it means for people to believe in him, love him, obey him, and abide in him. So we'll talk a little bit more about abiding in him later. Some of the major themes are that Jesus is the true revelation of God incarnate. And then we know the beginning of this gospel is the Word becoming flesh, right? So that incarnational embodiment of God. The gospel's adamant, though, about also emphasizing the humanity of Jesus, in that he feels grief, he feels fatigue and anguish, and he gets suspicious, sometimes a little bit irritable. But Jesus never claims to be above the Father. He is subordinate to the Father and dependent upon God for everything that he does. But Jesus is God, and John's gospel speaks of God in twofold sense, God the Father and God the Son. And elevates Jesus and exalts Jesus as the embodiment and the epitome of God's love put on earth. So those are some of the major themes of the gospel. Its origin, most scholars agree that it was written post 70 AD. Most give a range of maybe 90 to 110. And 70 AD is one of those dates that's really important in biblical scholarship because that was the date of the destruction of the Second Temple. So this community would know of a destruction of that space, that holy space. Some scholars think that the location in which the gospel was written might have been in Ephesus, right? Is Ephesus on my? There's Ephesus, yeah. So if you can see this, it's present day Turkey. But you notice, my gosh, look at all the other influences that came through Ephesus, through trade and migration. You have Greece, you have Thessalonica. So it was an urban and cosmopolitan area. So if not Ephesus, other scholars may think Libya or some places down here. But I tend to think Ephesus fits. That's just my opinion. As I mentioned, a late first century date, probably 90 to 110. The community that produced this gospel, scholars call the Johannine Community. There's kind of been a traditional understanding of the gospel writer as maybe being the beloved disciple. The gospel was written by someone who had walked with Jesus and had been a follower or a disciple of Jesus. Most scholars don't think that's true necessarily. However, what we see in the gospel are hints and echoes of stories that probably originated earlier than when the text was actually written. And also there was likely an editor who put together the finished product, close to what we have now in our text, and constructed this narrative and this collection of philosophical understandings, sayings, narratives together to create a coherent gospel story. So it's likely that there was a community that was coalescing around these gospel stories and all the stories of Jesus. And they seem to have been in confrontation with some other groups in their area that were Jewish groups. And I say this a lot, the Gospel of John has been used for anti-Semitic purposes, many tragic occasions. But we need to keep in mind that these were conflicts between folks that were moving into a new understanding of what it meant to follow Jesus, and those that didn't see Jesus as the Messiah and were still engaged in traditional synagogue-based worship. So it was more of a community type inter-scene rivalry than a great confrontation between two world religions, if that makes sense. So we have this community that is wrestling with what it means to follow Jesus and is doing so in what we think was a pretty cosmopolitan area with influences coming from all around the Mediterranean basin. An early commentator on the book of John was Clement. Yes.
Why were they in that particular area? Were they into missions like Peter was? Or did he not?
Well, we had, let's see, lots of missionary journeys here. So, the seeds of Christ following had been planted probably earlier, through Paul and the letter to the Ephesians. So those communities have started to grow within this area.
So John and
Yes, probably the author of John was part of that, a community that had been initiated through the missionary efforts of maybe Paul and others who've gone in. And remember, Paul's writings are the earliest in the canon that we have that we call the New Testament. So scholars date Paul's writings significantly prior to particularly the writing of the Gospel of John. So what we're reading in here is a later manifestation of a community's understanding of Jesus and God and their theological perception.
the thing to reverse chronological.
I know, isn't that the case? Yeah, it's kind of misleading because if we did it chronologically, letters from Paul would be at the beginning.
Well, I'm asking, do you know why certain things were left out, like parables and that kind of things? It'd be so hard to write about Jesus without writing about that.
Well,
They were misunderstood a lot.
yeah, they were.
But it was his way of teaching.
Right. Well, I guess my supposition is, we don't know. We can go back and ask them. But my guess is that the author had a particular theological intent that didn't require the use of the parabolic structures, that the theological claims being made in the Gospel of John needed to be presented in a different fashion possibly for the audience that these texts were being read to. But I want to quote Clement of Alexandria. This is Eusebius actually quoting Clement of Alexandria. Last of all, John, perceiving the external facts had been made plain in the gospel, urged his friends, and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel. So that may kind of play into your question, that it's a different sort of gospel that makes different sorts of claims.
Do you think that those other books would have been known? I mean, because to the way you're putting it there, it would almost seem, Tom, your comment. So if you already had the Pauline writings, and then somebody says, hey, tell the same story, but tell it differently. Use a different, whatever, to the extent that if those are appealing to this group, we wanted to have a more universal appeal.
Well, we didn't have a printing press back in this time. So the availability of Paul's letters may have been very limited. Stories and philosophies were usually presented orally. So we don't really know. That's a good question. We really don't know what this community may have had access to. I would suspect they did have bits and pieces of a prior understanding. But So, and another element of this I want to talk about that's a bit unique to John is that in John, Jesus is the supreme manifestation of God's word and the embodiment of divine wisdom. In the beginning was the word. And some of the scholars I read, because I was really curious, is what is this? What is the word? Have y'all ever wondered what that means? Well, there's not a whole lot of agreement. But one of the scholars I read likened it to divine wisdom. And if you remember in the Old Testament, particularly in the Greek writing of the Old Testament, which is the Septuagint, is the Greek. The divine wisdom, Sophia, is a feminine. It's for you, Fred. Yeah. Sophia is the embodiment of divine wisdom. So if that's true, then in the beginning was Sophia, divine wisdom, which if Jesus is the Word incarnate, then Jesus is the incarnation, the embodiment of divine wisdom. Something to think about. Red?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that John was a smart man. He knew how to pitch this to the education body. It was excellent at the time. And so remarkable. He was very direct. We're not out in the field with the shepherds looking for something. 2 cats on the camel, we don't figure it in. No, this is, I am who I am. Look out and listen. Wake up. Just beautiful.
Have you all heard the term Gnosticism? Okay. There are elements of Gnostic thought in this. It's heavily reliant on, a lot of scholars think, Greek philosophical terms, and we'll get into this as we wrestle with this text that we're assigned for the day. But I think you're right, Fred. I think, this text was written and edited, paying particular attention to the audience that would have heard it and what their worldview would be and the influences that would surround them, which, would have been cosmopolitan, Greco-Roman. So those concepts come into play in this reading today. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Instead of reading the text in an English translation, I'm going to do a real dirty translation from the Greek. So it's going to sound really weird, but I want you to hear this. And I'm going to start, I'm not going to say it in Greek because I have a tendency to butcher it, but this is a literal translation from the Greek. And I'm going to start with John 8:31. Was saying therefore, and so if you want to read along with the English and you can kind of see, was saying therefore Jesus to the having believed in him Jews, if you abide in the word. Now the literal Greek would have this text translated as abide. Abide in the word, my truly disciples of me you are. Sounds like Yoda. Okay, 8:32. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Or sorry, set free you. Say it, are you? They answered unto him, seed of Abraham, sperma Abraham. Seed of Abraham we are, and to no one have we been under bondage ever. How you say free you will become. Okay, and 34. Answered them, Jesus, truly, truly, I say to you that everyone practicing the sin, a slave is of the sin. 35. Now the slave not abides, Menai, abides in the house to the age. The son abides to the age. Forever is to the age. If therefore the son you shall set free, indeed free you will be. 37. I know that seed of Abraham you are, but you seek me to kill, because the word in Greek, logos, and then we just talked about the word and kind of a understanding from the Hebrew of Sophia, and then of me, not receives a place in you. And then last chapter, that which I have seen with the Father, I speak also you, therefore, what you have heard from the Father, you do. And that last you do is an imperative. So it sounds a little bit different, huh? Yeah. But that's what translators are tasked to do, is to go into these texts, try to make sense of it in ways that in the grammar and in the lexicons of our languages can read and understand. But, and I did that because our lesson today, the author talks about the word abide and how it's translated differently in this particular text in our English language Bibles. And I went back and I looked because I'm always curious when these switches happen. And this seems to have started in the Latin Vulgate, which was one of the Latin text of the Bible. And that if you read an English translation of the Latin, it uses the word, what is it here? If you continue. So continue is kind of an old way of translating it. But as we heard, the Greek literally is abide. And in John 15, 1 through 7, they use that term. But I'm always, interested in the nuances behind the words that are chosen, in translation. And I was curious, I wanted to ask you all, when you hear the word abide, what is that? What are some of the connotations and interpretations you make when you hear that particular word?
Well, I assign it as a harsh word.
Harsh.
I don't like it.
You don't like it?
Not at all. It's a command. I'd like to discuss it. Ask questions.
Abide. Yeah, harsher.
It's like consistency with the presence. The abide is the presence that we have with each other. And abide, tell me, I would interpret that same. Remain consistent.
Okay.
We remain together. There's two presence.
So your interpretation would align closer to continue with.
Continue the relationship.
To continue a relationship. Okay. Any other thoughts on what abide brings up for you? I don't know why, but for me, it kind of felt like to be rooted in, to be really immersed in something, if I abide in something, it's almost has a deeper sense to me than to continue with.
So I see it as a two-person thing. Somebody
Okay.
saying to somebody else, join me, or where do you abide, or, well, I don't know, maybe a confusion or either. Of course, I keep thinking, what is it, him that abide with me?
Yeah.
I can't remember the first anyway. But, I would think it would be saying, are you with me?
Uh-huh. Well, it certainly has a relational understanding, right? And an intimacy that maybe continuing in lacks to a degree. Because, when you abide with someone, it's like you're living with them. Maybe abide with me, stay with me.
It's one of those words that has taken on a different meaning from what it, if you just saying abide means to stay or live with or visit with someone or stay overnight or whatever, but that's not at all the way we take it.
No, and it's one of those words we don't necessarily use a lot in our common.
Because for me, it's connected with the word not. I do not abide. I do not
Oh,
abide.
you cannot abide with, yeah, okay.
And I grew up with a lot of elderly people.
Who would say that?
And I thought some of them were quite strange. And we said to them, I cannot abide this situation.
Mm,
Well, we don't like you. I go to school.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, how does this chapter begin? What's the story that begins chapter 8? It's Jesus not abiding by a group of people trying to stone a woman accused of adultery, right? Jesus couldn't abide by that. And so, we talk about John kind of being a little bit bereft of these stories, but this chapter starts with a story. And that's Jesus, getting down on the ground and, writing something in the sand and says, whosoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And then they all back off. Because Jesus couldn't abide in the sin of those who would falsely accuse this woman of adultery, or maybe, he felt that the punishment under the law that they were being governed by was too harsh, couldn't abide by it. So I see what you mean there, Fred. But yeah, so this chapter actually starts with Jesus kind of staking a claim and making a bit of a commentary on sin. And in some ways, turning that upside down. But to go back to abide, because when this section starts, we hear that Jesus is saying it to the Jews who had believed in him, that if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth. So if you abide in, if you continue with, you stay connected, if you are in relationship with my word, and one could argue that because Jesus is the word, being in relationship to not just what Jesus says in the literal sense of the word, but the totality of who Jesus is. So now we're getting into the word. We have the word. Now we're going to talk about the truth. Okay. Now this is where the dense philosophical elements, I think, of the Gospel of John kind of come into play. And we're entering into the realm of epistemology. And epistemology is study the science of how do we come to know the truth? What is truth? And I'm going to ask you, Fred, what is truth?
I have wrestled with that my whole life.
Yeah.
But truth, I think, is listening,
Uh-huh.
number one. Tell me all you know. It's a little bit, it's actually a little bit. Tell me all you know.
Uh-huh.
Then we can talk, discuss.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a sense that truth kind of can evolve out of relationship and listening to others, to being in connection with others. Maybe, is that what I'm hearing from you?
That's good, thank you.
Okay.
My wife, as I walked out the door, said, please be careful. You need friends.
Oh.
Don't alienate the class.
No.
But here we are.
Any other thoughts on truth?
I would say truth is just so abstract. Fred's truth, they are highly probable that his truth would be consistent with mine.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with him though, that truth about Betty's.
The truth of Betty's.
Oh, yeah, so we are absolutely going on that one.
I listened to you. And hey, you
But also, I think that we always hear truth or liberty or liberty.
Right.
So I think about that too. And there are different kinds of truths.
Uh-huh. Right. And there are different ways of knowing. In fact, there was a book that was written, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, entitled Women's Ways of Knowing. And it was a theological book. And I encountered it when I was in seminary. And it was a critique of this logical Western tradition of empiricism as the sole, and if not the sole, the preeminent ways that we come to know truth in our society. And the author talked quite a lot about the relational elements of how we come to know what is true by listening to one another, to be in community. And I remember, she said that if we live in, and this is true, and we all know this in our present context, when we live in our little bubbles and all we hear is little, we're in this little echo chamber, and all we hear are, the things that we want to hear, and we filter out everything else, we certainly run the risk of missing out on a bigger picture and larger truths.
Whether this is related or not, but I think a characteristic of the present society is the way we get our news. Some of my friends will not take the Charlotte Observer. They won't read because they don't agree with it politically. And my wife gets upset if I watch the local Fox television station. My purpose there is that they have a good local news show, and I like that. But if you say Fox to a liberal, it goes up, And we're so segmentalized on how you want to say it, and we've consciously done that.
These silos that we.
There's, I don't know much about social media, but I know there's certain social media that leans to a particular way, and even if, I guess this is the case, even if you go to Facebook or you go to, what's the others I'm trying to.
Twitter or Instagram or all those others. Well, Facebook is,
It's an ages of.
yeah, and, the complexities there are, these are businesses that, are driven by the profit motive, and so they have,
If we only hear one side of the story,
Right.
we're not in the best position to make a good decision or find truth.
right,
Isn't this what our mother stories were worried about? If we hang with the wrong crowd, we're gonna be informed a certain way.
uh-huh,
So mothers always want to know, who are you hanging with? Who are
Right.
you running with?
what kind of messages are you getting?
Right, and I was reminded of that in terms of John 8 invites us to honor truth and freedom from the standpoint of the relationship rather than logic of mission. That speaks for itself.
Mm-hmm,
The people we hang with are shape and mold us.
mm-hmm,
What we think, what we don't.
that's right,
We live in a day and age now that there are some folks who think that they can say anything and will believe it.
right. So therefore, what Gus just said, that if we hang out, if we abide with Jesus, then the truth that we will be receiving is that stems from the word, Sophia, wisdom, if we want to draw that line back. But we struggle in this society, and I thought, Tom, you mentioned the self-selecting elements of how we get, I will say, information that leads to an understanding of what truth may be.
We do it with our churches.
Yeah,
First thing people ask, they're going to church.
where do you go to?
Conservative or liberal?
Yeah, interesting.
And then there's a bunch of questions we get into. We've had people that come to this church for the past 5 years because they left the church with leaning conservative.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes you wonder, would Jesus even consider that question, obviously those are terms that would not be in the lexicon of that time. But what I do see is that, in Jesus calling people to abide with him and knowing the truth, that there is a statement and there is evidence of Jesus's posture toward the world. And even in John, that doesn't rely a lot on parables or these stories of the kingdom. I mean, like I said, this chapter opens with Jesus doing something very subversive and, very unexpected, of intervening in a case where a woman is, according to the law, getting her just desserts, and Jesus interrupts that. So we see Jesus time and time again siding with those who have been marginalized by narrow readings of religious law and empire that, sees folks like that woman as disposable and not worthy of, the love and mercy and attention of someone who would be in a place of religious prominence. So that's kind of where I see maybe Jesus talking about, what is the truth of this word, and abiding in that may have something to do with understanding how we can align more with the folks who are in marginalized spaces rather than the people in power, right? Another element I wanted to talk about in this particular pericope is that Jesus says, very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. What does that make you think of? Committing sin and then being a slave to it. The author.
I mean, I think just knowing that he knew that every one of us commits a sin. I mean, that he wasn't speaking to, to people thinking, oh, there are the sinless among them, and then there are the sinners. Knowing that everyone sins, he was making a point that had to hit home with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess there might be some who think they don't, but my guess was that he knew that he was gonna, get everybody's attention.
Slave meant something different from these people, what it means today.
Yeah,
I mean, we see it as a terrible thing, has no good to it whatsoever. But they probably saw it more like what was expected back.
it was part of a social structure, I think, more of an accepted social structure in the Greco-Roman world, but it wasn't chattel slavery. It wasn't slavery based on a racialized.
It'd be more like we call somebody with drug problem addiction.
It's a slave to sin.
Meaning
Right.
can't get away from it.
Right.
It's got you.
But I want to hold to what James said, because just prior to Jesus saying this, the Jews who had believed in him, after he says, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free, they answered him, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. Is that?
Talk about Egyptians, didn't they?
I know. Talk about selective history. And then they go on to say, what do you mean by saying you will make us free? So I think there's an element maybe of a little bit of self-righteousness. Hey, we're just going to completely forget our history and claim that, we have never been slaves. And, then Jesus brings in the fact that you have been slaves to sin. He doesn't completely call them out on the fact that they're using a selective memory of their own history. But to be enslaved to sin is to be captured by that, I think. And I think, addictions, preoccupations with certain things are part of that. And, I think individually, we have to be concerned about, stuff like that. But I also think that there's a systemic element to this too, because we all, in our context, we're slaves to sin too. And the fact we're addicted to capitalist society, we still have a racist structure that we as white folks benefit from. And in a sense, we're kind of slaves to that. And it's really difficult to break out. But Jesus calls to us and says, if you stay with me, continue with me, abide with me, you're going to know the truth. And that truth will set you free. And I was going to say, we're almost out of time. You may have heard the term, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So that's not gospel, but I heard that said. And I think there's an element of truth to that, because confronting these systems of violence and subjugation, for me, has made me upset, uncomfortable. But Jesus invites us to be uncomfortable with me, abide with me, And we're going to walk through this together. So that's where I think is the wonderful gospel message in this particular text. So, sorry, we could not cover every single philosophical question that lies within this, but it's a really great text to wrestle with. So, will you join with me in prayer to close, please? Loving and gracious God, we give thanks for the opportunity to wrestle together with your word, with your wisdom, Sophia, and with the promises that you bring in revealing yourself to us. We ask that you be with those in our congregation and community who are struggling with illness and with who are grief, who are mourning. We are grateful that you have returned our dear friend Tammy back to us today. We ask that anyone who is struggling with COVID now feel your healing presence. We ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you.